My daughter-in-law had cancer, and the treatment cost over £30 million. My son sold everything: the house, the car, even their wedding rings. She survived, but soon after, she said, "I don't want to live with a poor man," and filed for divorce. She took half of what little my son had left and full custody of the children. My heartbroken son came back to live with me. That night, an unknown man knocked on the door. "I need to speak to your son. I'm glad you're here." If you're watching this video, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening to my story of revenge from. I want to know how far it's reached. I was in the small kitchen, my hands still covered in flour from the last batch of bread I was preparing for the shop the next morning. The wall clock struck 9 p.m. Its ticking mingled with the soft scent of flour and yeast. The house was silent. All I could hear was my murmur, counting the loaves left to bake. Then the phone rang, a cold ring that cut through the air. I jumped, dropping the flour to the floor. Who would call at this hour? My children rarely did so late, unless something serious had happened. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked quickly to the old telephone on the wooden shelf. On the screen appeared the name of Jack, my son. I answered, my voice a little shaky. "Hello, Jack?" On the other end, there was only heavy breathing, as if he was trying to hold something back. "Mum." Jack's voice sounded hoarse, lost, like someone caught in the middle of a storm. I'd never heard him like that, not even when his father died. My heart tightened, but I tried to stay calm. "What's wrong, son? Tell me." "I'm listening." He remained silent for a long time, so long that I thought he'd hung up. Then he uttered a sentence, each word as if strangled. "Eleanor wants a divorce." I stood motionless, gripping the receiver. Divorce. Eleanor, my daughter-in-law. The woman Jack loved more than his life, for whom he gave everything to save her. No, it couldn't be. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the idea. "What did you say? Divorce? Why? What happened? Why so suddenly?" Jack told me, his voice choppy, desperate. Eleanor had filed for divorce and was asking for custody of their 2 children, Liam and Sophie, my little angels. Not only that, she also wanted to divide the house. I asked him the reason again and again, but Jack just kept repeating, "I don't know, Mum. She didn't say anything, just that she doesn't feel anything anymore, that she doesn't feel anything anymore. How was that possible?" I remembered the nights Jack held Eleanor when she was ill, the sleepless prayers he offered, begging for her life. How could anyone forget all that? I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself to reassure him. "Easy, son. All couples have difficult times. Maybe Eleanor is just angry. You did everything for her. You gave up everything. She can't treat you like that." I asked him to take care of himself, to try to talk to his wife, and I hung up. But as I put down the receiver, my hands trembled. I felt a weight in my chest, as if a huge stone was crushing my heart. The following days, I called him several times. Sometimes he didn't answer. Other times, he answered in a dull, exhausted voice. He told me that Eleanor had hired a solicitor who was as distant as a stranger and wouldn't let him get near the children. 3 weeks after that first call, it started to rain heavily. I was sitting at the table, holding a cold cup of tea. When I heard some taps on the door, I got up and pulled back the curtain. Under the yellowish light of the porch, I saw Jack standing there, soaked, his face haggard, his beard neglected. Beside him, an old travel suitcase with broken edges. My heart stopped. I flung open the door and pulled him inside without asking anything. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes and suddenly collapsed, crying like a child. "Mum, I lost everything. She took the children and the house. She wants to sell it to divide the money." I hugged my son tightly, feeling his back tremble under my hand. My Jack, the strong man who once carried the whole family, was now as fragile as a dry branch in the storm. His suitcase burst open, and some belongings rolled onto the floor. A crumpled t-shirt, some old shoes, and a small photo of Liam and Sophie. I looked at the photo. I saw the radiant smiles of my grandchildren, and tears welled up in my eyes too. I helped Jack inside. I know what. Like when he was a child, I made him a hot cup of ginger tea and forced him to drink it, sip by sip. He sat motionless in the chair, his gaze lost on the wall. I didn't know what to say to him. I just gently placed my hand on his shoulder and murmured, "Stay here with me as long as you need, son." But deep down, I knew those words couldn't ease his pain. That night, when Jack fell asleep on the sofa, I sat silently at the dining room table, unable to close my eyes. The house was calm. Only the rain hitting the tin roof and my son's heavy breathing could be heard. I looked at him, his disheveled hair covering his face that was once full of life. I remembered the days when he and Eleanor had just gotten married, how he held her hand, the sparkle in his eyes when talking about the future. I had believed that Eleanor was the gift God had given my son, but now she was the one who had dealt him the most painful blow of his life. Suddenly, firm knocks on the door jolted me from my thoughts. I jumped, my heart pounding. Who could be coming at this hour in the middle of the rain? I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. An unknown man was there, thin, looking tired, and with sunken eyes as if he hadn't slept in days. I narrowed the door, speaking cautiously. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man hesitated for a moment, his voice hoarse, not daring to look directly at me. "I'm looking for Mr. Jack Smith." I was about to close the door and tell him my son was ill, but he raised his hand, hurried, his voice desperate. "Please, ma'am. I'm Philip. I know your son's wife, Mrs. Eleanor Davies. I've come to tell you the truth." The truth? Those two words pierced my chest like a knife. I looked at him, trying to decipher something in his tired eyes. There was something in his voice, a mixture of desperation and sincerity that kept me from turning my back on him. My mind filled with confusing thoughts that, without realizing it, took me back to where it all began. I still clearly remember that Saturday night, over a year ago, when the whole family gathered around the big table in my house. The smell of freshly made Sunday roast filled the air. That dish that Jack and my grandchildren, Liam and Sophie, my two little treasures, loved the most, they were fighting over the last piece of Yorkshire pudding, laughing out loud. Jack, sitting at the head of the table, was telling a funny story about a customer at the garage who swore his car was haunted because the headlights flickered on their own. We all laughed. Even Eleanor smiled sweetly, serving more meat onto her husband's plate and wiping Sophie's mouth with a napkin. Seeing her, I thought my son was lucky. Eleanor was beautiful, kind, attentive, an angel sent by God to take care of him. But then, just when the atmosphere was warmest, Eleanor put her cutlery down on her plate. The small sound of the clash against the porcelain made me shiver. Her smile vanished abruptly like a light switched off. Suddenly, the room fell silent, and all eyes turned to her. I saw her hands trembling, her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak immediately. Slowly, she opened her handbag and pulled out a sheet of paper folded in four, placing it on the table as if it weighed a ton. I looked at it, and a dark premonition ran through my body. Jack, sitting beside her, frowned and reached out to take it. He opened it, and I saw my son's face turn as pale as the paper. His hands trembled, his eyes fixed on those written lines. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice broken by worry. She took a deep breath, as if she needed to gather all her courage to speak. Then, between sobs, she said in a trembling voice, each word cutting the air like a razor, "The doctor said, I have uterine cancer, stage 3. The whole room fell silent. Liam and Sophie's laughter died down. I felt breathless, as if all the oxygen in the room had disappeared. Jack was the first to react. He crumpled the paper in his hands and ran to hug his wife, his voice trembling. "It can't be. I don't believe it. No, Eleanor, it can't be." He repeated it over and over, as if saying it would make the reality disappear. Eleanor sank into his arms, crying inconsolably, her fragile shoulders trembling uncontrollably. Stunned, I reached out to take the crumpled paper from Jack's hands. The printed letters, cold and clear, along with the red stamp of a large hospital in Birmingham, left no room for doubt. Uterine cancer stage I and B, accompanied by the signature of Dr. Ernest White. I read it again and again, as if I could find a mistake, a flaw in the printing, something to prove it was a misunderstanding. But that crisp, cruel red stamp seemed to drive a thorn into my heart. My motherly instinct awakened in me. I coughed softly, trying to stay calm. "Eleanor, Jack, listen to me. I have an old friend, Dr. Miller. He's one of the best oncologists in the city. We should go see him." But Eleanor strongly refused, hiding deeper in Jack's chest. "No, Mum." Her voice was weak, full of fear. "I'm so scared. The doctor from Birmingham has already made the treatment plan. I don't want to start over. I don't want to see anyone else." Her words were a plea that completely disarmed me. Jack, still in a panic, rejected my suggestion. "Mum, please, don't scare her anymore. We'll follow this doctor's treatment. I'll do everything, Eleanor, I swear. I'll sell everything. I'll take you to the best hospital if necessary." He took her hand, his eyes full of determination, although I also saw desperation in them. The dinner ended in tears and a heavy silence. Liam and Sophie, though young, felt the change in the atmosphere. They no longer fought over the Yorkshire pudding. They stayed still, their big eyes looking at their parents. I tried to smile, to maintain normality, serving them more food. "Eat, my loves. Grandma will tell you the story of the fox and the stork." But my voice trembled, and the story never continued. As I cleared the table, I noticed that Eleanor's soup plate was still untouched. Cold. She was there, staring into space. I wanted to approach her, ask if anything hurt, if she needed anything, but something in her gaze stopped me. Perhaps I was just overreacting. I told myself, "She's sick. She needs time." That night, when my son and his family returned to their home, I stayed awake in my old bed. The image of the diagnosis kept replaying in my mind, along with Eleanor's choppy voice. I thought of Jack, how he would do the impossible to save her. I thought of Liam and Sophie, those innocent little ones who didn't deserve to suffer. And I thought of myself, an elderly mother who only wanted to see her children and grandchildren happy. Finally, I made a decision. I would temporarily move in with Jack and his family. I would tell them it was to look after the children and help around the house. But in reality, I wanted to be close to Eleanor, to make sure she received the best possible care. I couldn't leave my son's family alone in the midst of this storm. The day I arrived with my suitcase, Jack and Eleanor's house no longer had its usual warmth. The wooden door was the same, but the children's laughter was no longer heard in the garden. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with sadness and worry. Liam and Sophie were playing in a corner, but quieter than usual, as if they didn't want to bother anyone. Eleanor was lying on the sofa, covered with a thin blanket, her face pale. Jack, meanwhile, was reviewing some papers with an anguished expression. I entered, placed my suitcase on the floor, and smiled as best I could. "I'm here. From today, I'll help you, Eleanor. Rest. Let me take care of everything." Eleanor looked up and managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Mum. I'm very lucky to have you." Her words warmed my heart. The first week after the diagnosis, Jack decided to sell the garage's delivery van. It was an old vehicle with an engine that roared every time he started it, but it was his main tool for work. I remember the evenings when Jack and his father, my husband, would sit and clean it together, laughing as they talked about long delivery trips. The day Jack put it up for sale, I saw him standing in the yard, a cloth in his hand, slowly wiping the worn paint. His eyes were full of nostalgia, as if saying goodbye to a part of his youth. The buyer arrived, a middle-aged man with a gruff voice who offered such a low price that I wanted to scream it was a robbery. But Jack only nodded. He signed with a trembling hand and said softly, "Thank you." Then he handed all the money to Eleanor. Less than a month later, Jack put the garage up for sale. The legacy his father had left him. That place not only represented his livelihood but also the shared memory between father and son. I remember when Jack was a child, running after his dad, holding a spanner and curiously asking how an engine was fixed. On the day of the handover, I stood beside him, watching him silently observe the oil-stained floor. The buyer, a businessman from the city, again offered a ridiculous price. But Jack didn't argue. He just nodded. He signed the papers and left without looking back. When the money started to run out, I noticed that the finger where Jack wore his wedding ring was empty. The simple silver ring that he and Eleanor had exchanged on their wedding day was gone. I asked him, my voice trembling, "Jack, where's your ring?" He didn't look at me. He just murmured, "I sold it, Mum. The pawn shop paid well." I felt as if my heart was being squeezed. That ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was the promise he had made to Eleanor, the symbol of their love. I wanted to run to the pawn shop to get it back. but I knew it wouldn't change anything. Jack had already made his decision, and I could only watch in silence, my soul in pieces. Every time Jack brought money home, Eleanor would cry. She would take his rough hand, look at his empty finger, and sob, "Forgive me, Jack. I don't want you to suffer like this for me." Her tears moved me. One afternoon, while Jack was out looking for more money, I went into my room, opened the wardrobe, and took out an old tin box. Inside was all my life's savings, every pound saved for my old age. For the days when I could no longer bake, I carried the box to Jack and placed it in his hands. "Take it, son," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Saving your wife is the most important thing." He looked at me with red eyes, unable to speak. "Thank you, Mum," he murmured and turned away, as if he feared I would notice his fragility. One morning, Eleanor suddenly announced that she had to go to Birmingham Hospital for a special radiotherapy treatment that would last all day. She looked weak, with pale skin and tired eyes. She hugged Liam and Sophie tightly and told them, "Listen to Grandma and your dad. Mum will be back soon." Her voice was soft but firm, as if she didn't want anyone to argue. Jack wanted to accompany her, but she refused. "Don't worry, I can go alone. You've worked too much already." She wore a thick coat, although it was a sunny, warm day, saying that her body was now very sensitive to temperature. I watched her leave through the door, handbag on her shoulder, a slow pace, and I felt a strange unease in my chest. That night, Eleanor returned exhausted. She collapsed into Jack's arms. She said she was very tired and went to bed early. I watched him hug her, his eyes full of tenderness, and my heart ached as I gathered the family's dirty laundry to wash. My hands touched Eleanor's coat. It was a little damp, as if it had been splashed with water. Out of habit, I checked the pockets before putting it in the washing machine. My fingers brushed against a piece of stiff paper. I pulled it out, thinking it was a prescription or a medical appointment, but it was a restaurant bill. The Golden Arch Inn, one of the city's most elegant places, where people like us rarely dared to go. My eyes fixed on the details. 2 steaks, a bottle of red wine, chocolate dessert. The total was enough to do a whole week's shopping, but what made my heart tremble was the date and time. That same midday, just when Eleanor said she was at the radiotherapy session, I stood motionless, the bill trembling between my fingers. No, it couldn't be. Eleanor was sick. She couldn't have gone to an expensive restaurant to eat like that. There must be some mistake. Perhaps she sat next to someone in the hospital, and that person accidentally put the receipt in her pocket. I kept repeating that to myself, trying to drive away the suspicion that was starting to grow within me. I was about to go into Jack and Eleanor's bedroom to ask her the truth. But as I reached the door, I heard her calm breathing and stopped. I imagined Eleanor waking up, her face pale, her eyes full of fear, and I knew I would hurt her if I confronted her over just a piece of paper. I convinced myself, "Don't think nonsense. She's very ill. Don't make her worry more." I folded the bill and put it back in the coat pocket, but the numbers kept swirling in my head. About 2 months after those days full of tension due to Eleanor's illness, I began to believe that light was returning to our family. One afternoon, I was preparing a simple dinner at Jack's house, trying to make shepherd's pie, the dish everyone adored, to liven up the atmosphere. Liam and Sophie were scribbling on some papers while Jack, fresh from work, still smelled of oil and metal. Eleanor entered the dining room with a radiant expression, very different from her weak appearance before. She held a sheet of paper, her hands slightly trembling, but her eyes shining as if she had found a treasure. "Mum, Jack." "Children, listen," she said in a clear, almost joyful voice. "The doctor said the cancer cells have completely disappeared. I'm cured." I froze. The spoon dropped from my hand and hit the table with a dry clatter. Jack dropped his plate, and the sound of breaking china echoed on the floor. He snatched the paper from Eleanor's hands, his eyes fixed on the printed lines, reading them over and over, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Really, Eleanor? Really?" His voice broke, and he suddenly hugged his wife, crying with joy. He lifted her in his arms and spun her around the room, laughing like a child who had just received the gift he most desired. Liam and Sophie, though they didn't fully understand what was happening, ran to hug their parents' legs, laughing too. Seeing that scene, I felt a weight I had been carrying in my chest dissolve. Tears welled up, not from sadness but from relief. I had blamed myself for doubting Eleanor, for letting that restaurant bill torment me. She had fought, she had overcome the illness, and now our family could start anew. I hugged her and whispered, "You gave me a fright, but thank goodness you're well." She smiled, hugged me back, and replied in a trembling voice, "Thank you, Mum, for always being with me." Her words filled my heart, as if all past worries had vanished, like a distant nightmare. We all sat around the table, and for the first time in months, the atmosphere was filled with laughter. Jack told old anecdotes, like the time he ruined a customer's car because he couldn't stop looking at Eleanor when she passed by the garage. Liam and Sophie competed to tell their school stories and show their drawings. I looked at them and silently prayed that from that moment on, everything would be better. The crisis had passed, and I decided to return to my house to give Jack's family their space back. The day I picked up my suitcase to leave, Eleanor took my hand, her eyes filled with tears. "Mom, I'll never forget everything you did for us. You're the best mother in the world." I smiled and patted her hand. "As long as you're healthy and your family is happy, I am happy." As I left through the door, I looked back. A warm, golden light escaped from the window. I thought perhaps that was the new beginning we all needed. But only a few weeks later, I began to notice strange signs. The Saturday family dinner, a tradition we had always respected. It was canceled for the first time. Eleanor called me, her voice soft but hurried. "Mum, Liam has a bit of a fever today. We won't be able to come. Forgive me." I worried and offered to go see the child, but she avoided it. "Don't worry, Mum. It's just a cold. We'll come next week." I nodded, though I felt a pang of sadness. The following week she called again, this time saying they were both exhausted after a hard week's work. "Mom, we need to rest a bit. We'll come next week, I promise." Her voice was still sweet, but something had changed. It sounded distant, as if she was putting up an invisible wall between us. Gradually, I realized that Eleanor no longer brought Liam and Sophie to visit me as often. Before, she used to come with them to the bakery. The children would play with the flour. They would laugh when I pretended to be a monster with my face covered in white dust. But now those visits became rare, and then almost completely disappeared. When I called her, she always had an excuse. "Mum, we're very busy this week." Or "Sophie has drawing classes. We can't arrange it." I tried to convince myself that she was just busy, that she needed time to recover after so many months of illness. But every time I hung up the phone, a feeling of emptiness pressed down on my chest. Then Jack started calling me, his voice full of worry. One night, while knitting a jumper for Sophie, the phone rang. "Mum." His voice sounded deep and heavy. "Lately, Eleanor has been very strange. She buys a lot of new clothes. She puts on a lot of makeup every time she goes out. Some nights she goes somewhere and comes back very late. She says she met old friends." My heart began to pound. Old friends. Eleanor hardly ever talked about friendships, and since she got sick, I never saw her go anywhere other than the hospital. I tried to stay calm. "Perhaps she just wants to relax a bit, son. She's just recovered from an illness. Maybe she wants to make up for the difficult days," but even I couldn't believe those words again. Jack called almost at midnight, his voice on the verge of despair. "Mum, last night Eleanor didn't come home. She said she stayed at a friend's house because she got drunk. I don't believe her, Mum, but I don't know what to do. I felt like I was going crazy." Eleanor, the same woman who before was so weak she could barely stand, now had the strength to party all night. "Calm down, son," I said, though I myself was a knot inside. "Give her time. Maybe she's just trying to find herself again." But deep down I knew I was lying to myself. The pieces were starting to fit. The restaurant bill, the miraculous recovery, the sudden change in her attitude. All were fragments of a puzzle that didn't fit. And I was afraid to complete it because I sensed that the final picture would be too painful. Sometimes I would deliberately drive past the street where Jack lived, just to see if the bedroom light was on. There were nights when the whole house was dark, even though it was only 8 o'clock. I would stay there, under the yellowish light of the street lamp, my heart heavy. My motherly instinct told me that a new storm was brewing. I remembered Eleanor's smile when she announced she was cured. I remembered the sparkle in her eyes, and I wondered if that joy was real or just a mask. I asked Jack to be patient, to give his wife time until that fateful night when the phone rang, and his broken voice came through the line. "Mum, Eleanor wants a divorce, and now I'm here, standing on the threshold, my hand gripping the doorknob, feeling a mixture of fear and anger. The man named Philip is in front of me, thin, with old soaked shoes, not daring to look me in the eye under the yellowish light of the hallway. His face looks tired, full of wrinkles that seem to tell a life of suffering. I ask in a cold but trembling voice, "What do you know about my daughter-in-law?" Philip hesitates. His lips move as if searching for words. "I know about her illness," he says in a hoarse voice, as if each word costs him great effort. The two words, her illness, pierce my chest like a knife. Illness, the same one that cost us so much effort, money, and hope. I look inside and see Jack sitting up on the sofa, his eyes wide open, looking towards the door. His face haggard, his eyes red from sleepless nights and pain. I take a deep breath, trying to stay calm, and with a nod of my head, I indicate to Philip to come in. "Please, come in," I say with a firmness I didn't know I possessed. The yellow light of the kitchen illuminates every wrinkle on his tired face, and that sight only increases my unease. Jack jumps up, his voice hoarse. "Mum, who is he?" He looks at Philip. Then he looks at me as if seeking an explanation. Before I can say a word, Philip lowers his head and murmurs, "I'm Philip Green. I'm an accountant at the health clinic where Eleanor worked as a nurse." His voice trembled, as if he could collapse with a gust of wind. I pulled out a chair, motioned for him to sit, but he just stood with his hands clasped, his gaze fixed on the small cracks in the old wooden table. Philip began to speak in a monotonous voice, but full of pain. He didn't dare look at Jack directly. He just fixed his gaze on the table, as if those cracks could hide his shame. He spoke of his wife, that she had a congenital heart condition since childhood and needed a very expensive operation, he said, his voice choked. He ran everywhere, he borrowed money, he sold land, but it wasn't enough. He didn't know what to do to save her. I felt my heart clench. I know that helplessness. To see someone you love leave and be unable to do anything. But then Philip's story chilled me to the bone. "Eleanor came looking for me," he continued, his voice even more trembling. "She knew about my situation. She knew I was desperate. She told me, 'I know how to get a lot of money quickly, but I need your help.' I felt my blood run cold. Eleanor, my daughter-in-law, whom I had seen as an angel. Philip said that Eleanor devised a cruel plan. She would pretend to have cancer. And he, with his job as an accountant and access to the clinic system, would fabricate a perfect false medical record. Blood test results, diagnostic images, stamps, the signature of a non-existent doctor. He did it all at Eleanor's request. She promised to pay me £50,000, he said, his eyes red. That amount was enough to save my wife. I sat there, my hands gripping the edge of the chair, trying not to tremble. Jack remained motionless, his gaze frozen, not blinking. Philip continued, his voice increasingly broken. I accepted. I knew it was wrong, but I had no other option. I did everything she asked, from invoices for special non-existent medications to false medical reports. I thought that if I saved my wife, I would face the consequences. But when the plan was carried out, when Eleanor received all of Jack's money, the money from the van, the garage, and even the wedding ring, she disappeared. She blocked Philip's number. She quit her job at the clinic. She cut off all contact. I went to her house, he said for the first time, looking up at Jack with a gaze full of guilt. She laughed and told me I had no proof. Then she kicked me out. The air in the kitchen became dense, as if all the oxygen had been depleted. Philip dropped his head onto the table, his shoulders shaking convulsively. 2 weeks later, my wife died, he whispered, his voice broken. She died in the hospital bed while I was still waiting for money that never came. I had to lean against the back of the chair to stay standing. My head was spinning. I looked at Jack, and my heart broke as I saw his face. He didn't scream. He didn't get angry. His face was empty, lifeless, as if his soul had left him. Slowly, he raised his hand and touched the finger where he used to wear his wedding ring, his gaze lost. Philip sat up and placed a bundle of thin, already crumpled papers on the table. "These are the drafts of the files I made," he said in a rough voice. "They have no legal value, but it's all I have. I came to confess and to help you get justice back." I looked at the bundle, the clumsy letters and the fake stamps, and a rage I hadn't known before washed over me. But more than rage, it was pain. Pain for my son, for what he sacrificed, for that blind love that led him to the abyss. Jack clenched his fist so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He turned to me, his gaze empty. "Mum," he said, his voice broken. "It turns out I sold everything I had for a scam." I felt as if my heart was breaking in two. But looking at Jack, seeing that desperation in his eyes, I knew I had to be strong. I put my hand on his shoulder and squeezed it as if wanting to pass him some strength. "Son," I said, my voice trembling, "we are going to find out the truth, I promise you." That night, the small kitchen in my house was plunged into a dense silence, broken only by the sound of the rain falling more slowly outside the window. Philip, Jack, and I were sitting around the old wooden table, each lost in thought, but all trapped by the painful truth Philip had just revealed. I looked at my son, motionless in the chair, his eyes empty, occasionally letting out a lifeless laugh, as if he still couldn't believe what he had just heard. Philip, his face gray, continued to recount more details of Eleanor's plan. He spoke of her intelligence and her cruelty, of how she had calculated every step to deceive Jack, from the fake hospital calls to her tears, and her role as a terminally ill patient. Every word of his was like a stab in the chest, but I forced myself to remain firm, to listen clearly. Eleanor knew how to make everyone believe her. Philip said in a trembling voice. "She once told me that with a few tears and a diagnosis paper, she could make anyone do what she wanted." I felt my blood boil. Eleanor, the girl I had treated like a daughter, who held my hand and thanked me for being by her side, was actually the one who had woven this whole web of lies. But looking at Jack with his head down and his face in his hands, I felt not only rage but also pain. Pain because my son had sacrificed everything, his car, his garage, his wedding ring, and his heart, only to fall into a trap. When the first rays of sun filtered through the window, painting the kitchen floor golden, Philip stood up, his slumped shoulders seeming to carry the weight of the world. "I'll go to the police station," he said in a firm voice, but full of remorse. "I'm going to confess everything. I can't keep living with this guilt." I looked at him, not knowing whether to feel compassion or anger. He was part of the deception, but he had also lost the woman he loved, just as Jack had lost his family. I nodded silently and got up to make coffee for the three of us, hoping a little warmth would restore our strength. The next morning, the police station was cold and deserted. The air smelled of old paper, ink, and dust. We waited for almost an hour in a long corridor, sitting on hard plastic chairs until a young police officer, still sleepy, agreed to see us. Philip began to speak in a calm but tense voice, as if walking on a tightrope. He pulled out a bundle of papers, copies of the fake files he had created for Eleanor. I watched the officer, expecting to see some reaction, but he just leafed through the papers indifferently before handing them back with a yawn. "Is that all?" he asked in a bored tone. "Your statement is just one version. Mrs. Eleanor Davies has legal medical documents, and you have nothing more than these papers. We cannot open an investigation based on a story without evidence." I felt the blood rush to my head. Jack, sitting beside me, tried to explain, his voice hoarse. "Don't you understand? I sold the car, the garage, even my wedding ring to pay for her illness treatment, and now she's taking everything, even my children." But the officer just shrugged and interrupted him. "Sounds like a property dispute after a divorce. Family matter. Get a solicitor." He made a gesture with his hand indicating for us to leave, and returned to focus on the pile of papers on his desk. We left the police station. The morning sun shone brightly, but my heart was plunged into darkness. Jack slumped onto the steps. He held his head in his hands and his voice broke. "It's over, Mom. Not even the law helps us." Philip stood to one side, his face pale and his hands clasped, as if he wanted to hide his guilt. I looked at the two men in front of me. One, my son, who had lost everything for love. The other, his accomplice. Now tormented by conscience, the rage and pain inside me had turned into something harder, like a silent fire, impossible to extinguish. I took Jack by the shoulders and forced him to his feet. "No, son," I said, looking him in the eyes with a firm voice. "If the law doesn't see, we'll make it see." He looked at me, and in his tired eyes, I saw a tiny spark of hope. Philip looked up and nodded, as if my words had also awakened in him a little determination. I knew we couldn't stop, that we couldn't let Eleanor get away with it. When we got home, I went straight to the old telephone on the shelf. My hands trembled as I opened the yellowed notebook, looking for a name I hadn't uttered in over 10 years. Thomas Riley had been my husband's colleague in the police, a private detective known for his cunning and for never giving up. I took a deep breath and dialed the number. On the other end, a deep, raspy voice answered. "Hello, who's speaking?" I introduced myself, my voice a little shaky. "Thomas, I'm Rose, John Smith's wife. I need your help." I told Thomas everything, from the restaurant bill I found in Eleanor's coat to the days Jack sold everything to save her. And finally, Philip's confession. I omitted no detail, though every word hurt like salt in an open wound. Thomas listened in silence, occasionally murmuring to let me know he was still there. When I finished, he only asked one question. "What is your daughter-in-law's full name, Eleanor Davies?" I answered, my voice trembling. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, as if he was searching his memory. Then he said thoughtfully, "I've heard that name before. There's something murky in her past. Stay calm. I'll help you." I hung up the phone and looked at Jack and Philip, feeling a ray of hope ignite within me. The next morning, as the first rays of sun filtered through the curtains, I heard soft but firm knocks on the door. I opened it, and there stood Thomas Riley. He didn't look like the elegant detective I had imagined. He wore an old, worn shirt, his hair gray and disheveled, his eyes tired but so sharp they seemed to see through secrets. He didn't say much, just nodded and entered with an aged leather briefcase in his hand. I invited him to sit and hastily prepared a cup of tea. Though inside, anxiety consumed me. "What have you found?" I asked, my voice trembling, unable to hide my impatience. Thomas placed the briefcase on the table, opened it, and took out the copy of the diagnosis Eleanor had given us. He took a small magnifying glass and carefully examined the red stamp and the shaky signature of Dr. Ernest White. He murmured in a grave voice, "This stamp is too perfect. It has no ink smudges. It looks printed, not hand-stamped." I was beside him, my heart pounding. Just one sentence, but it was enough to awaken all the doubts I had tried to bury. Jack, who had just come out of the bedroom, heard what he said and sat in the chair, his gaze tense. "What do you mean by that?" he asked in a hoarse voice. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He just shook his head and carefully folded the paper. "Give me a few days," he said before leaving Jack and me in a suffocating atmosphere full of unanswered questions. 2 days later, as I was cleaning the bakery, the phone rang. Thomas's monotonous voice on the other end of the line said, "The St. Giles General Hospital in Birmingham." The address listed on the documents is actually an empty plot of land awaiting development. It has never existed. I felt a shiver run down my spine and squeezed the receiver tightly. Jack, beside me, slumped into the chair, his face pale. Thomas continued, "And Dr. Ernest White, who signs the document, does not appear in the register of any medical association in the country. He's a ghost." I put him on speakerphone so Jack could hear too, but he just sat there staring blankly. Thomas added that he remembered the name Eleanor Davies from a medical insurance fraud case some years ago. It was a minor matter. It went unnoticed and was filed away when the victim suddenly withdrew the complaint. "I contacted that person," Thomas said in a calm but sharp voice. "She told me that Eleanor introduced herself as a nurse and promised them a miraculous treatment for diabetes from a secret doctor. They gave her money, but they never heard about that treatment again." I felt my blood run cold. Eleanor, the daughter-in-law I had loved and cared for so much, had such a dark past. With that information, Thomas began to investigate the supposed Dr. Ernest more thoroughly. He discovered that he used to frequent a rented house on the outskirts of the city. "I went there," he said over the phone. "I didn't go in. I just observed from the car and took photos." He described a common 2-story house, but with windows covered by thick curtains. Sometimes luxury cars would arrive, bring people, and leave immediately. As I listened, I imagined a mysterious place, like a lair of dark secrets. Then Thomas recounted that one afternoon he saw a man take out the rubbish to the yard. He waited until he left and secretly checked the bag. Inside, he found empty boxes of cheap, unlabeled supplements and, most importantly, a discarded USB stick. That night, Thomas came to my house. He didn't say anything. He simply turned on his old laptop and plugged in the USB. Mrs. Smith. "Mr. Jack, prepare yourselves," he said in a grave, serious voice. I sat next to Jack, taking his hand, feeling his palm cold as ice. Several videos appeared on the screen. The room in the video was arranged like an elegant private clinic, clean bed, heart rate monitor, and some medical equipment that looked very professional. Then Eleanor appeared. She wore a white coat, her hair tied back, a radiant smile. She was joking with a man we presumed was Ernest. They laughed loudly, as if sharing a funny story without the slightest worry. A different video began, and this time I felt my heart stop. Eleanor was lying in a hospital bed, her face made up to look pale, her eyes closed like a patient on the verge of death. Ernest was by her side, carefully connecting a saline bag to her arm, but when the camera moved, I clearly saw that the bag only contained saline water. Eleanor half opened her eyes, winked mischievously at the cameraman, and then returned to her role as a weak patient. I felt the blood rush to my head. My throat closed as if it were being squeezed. Jack suddenly stood up and overturned the small table next to him. The sound of breaking glasses echoed on the floor. He punched the wall fiercely and roared with pain and rage. She deceived me. She deceived my mother, my children. I remained seated, unable to move, my gaze fixed on the blank screen. Thomas closed the computer in silence, but the room remained plunged in a heavy silence, broken only by Jack's agitated breathing. Thomas looked directly at me, his voice deep and firm. "Mrs. Smith, your daughter-in-law is not a victim. She is the one behind the entire crime." The next morning, Thomas arrived early, looking as simple as ever, but with a determined gaze. He carried his old laptop and the bundle of papers Philip had given him. "Let's go, Mrs. Smith," he said in a low but firm voice. "Today we will make the police listen." I nodded and woke Jack. He sat up, his eyes bloodshot, but nodded with determination. We got into the car heading for the police station, without saying a word, silently watching the road, as if preparing for a battle at the police station. Thomas didn't let us stop at the reception like last time. He pulled out his retired police ID and asked to speak directly with the head of criminal investigations. The young clerk looked at him suspiciously, but after a brief call, we were led to a small meeting room with dull white walls, a long wooden table, and hard chairs. The chief, Inspector Davies, entered with his serious expression and cold gaze. He sat down, crossed his arms, and observed us with skepticism. "I've been told you have evidence of a scam, but I warn you, if this is just a family conflict, we don't have time." I felt my blood boil. I wanted to answer, but Thomas raised his hand to calm me. He placed the laptop on the table and played the video we had seen the night before. The room fell silent. Only the humming of the ceiling fan and Eleanor's sharp, knife-like laughter from the screen could be heard. When the video ended with Eleanor winking in her role as a fake patient, Inspector Davies's face changed completely. Distrust disappeared, replaced by a cold, sharp concentration. He picked up the phone. He called 2 more investigators. "Record everything," he ordered in a firm voice. We began to recount the whole story. I told him about the restaurant receipt, about the days Eleanor said she was going for radiotherapy and came back looking surprisingly radiant. Jack, in a hoarse voice, spoke of how he sold the car, the garage, and even the wedding ring, and the large sums of money he had given to Eleanor. Without hesitation, Philip, his gaze full of guilt, confessed his involvement in the fraud, how he falsified medical reports and the times he met Eleanor to plan it. When the investigator informed him that he would be arrested to cooperate with the investigation, Philip just nodded in a calm voice. "I'm not going to run. I lost my wife. I'm not going to lose my conscience, too." Before being taken away, he looked at me with regret. "Mrs. Smith, I'm sorry for putting you and Jack through this." I nodded without saying anything, but in my heart, I no longer held a grudge against him. He was also a victim, just like us. Jack presented all the documents, the sales contract for the car, the garage, and the bank statements showing the large sums of money transferred to Eleanor's account. When the investigator asked him what kind of compensation he wished to claim, Jack shook his head, his voice firm but full of pain. "I don't want possessions. I just want my children to be safe. Liam and Sophie don't deserve to go through this." Hearing him, I felt as if something was pressing on my chest. I took his hand under the table, squeezing it tightly, as if wanting to tell him that I wouldn't leave him alone with the video evidence, Philip's testimony, and Jack's documents. Inspector Davies didn't hesitate. He signed the urgent search warrant for the house Thomas called the Phantom Hospital, along with arrest warrants for Eleanor Davies, Ernest White, and the accomplices who appeared in the video. I watched him write each word, and a mixture of relief and tension ran through my body. Finally, justice was beginning to move. The investigators immediately sprung into action. Radios crackled in the hallways with short, precise orders. A special team was assembled, and I watched them checking their weapons, adjusting their bulletproof vests, and preparing to leave. The atmosphere in the police station became tense, like before a great battle. We finished the paperwork and left the station as night fell. I felt exhausted, but at the same time a strange sense of relief was making its way inside me. For the first time in many months, I felt like we were no longer alone. At that moment, several patrol cars turned on their sirens in unison. Blue and red lights flashed as the cars sped out of the gate and disappeared into traffic. I stood on the steps, holding Jack's hand, watching the convoy until it vanished. The sound of the sirens faded away, but for me, it was the sound of justice. A sound for which we had paid too high a price to hear. That night, Jack and I couldn't sleep. We stayed in the small kitchen, under the yellowish light that illuminated the old walls, as if reminding us of all the pain we had endured. Jack held tightly to the photo of Liam and Sophie. His gaze was lost, as if searching for a ray of light in the midst of darkness. I made ginger tea, but neither of us touched it. We just remained there, in silence, waiting for news from Thomas. Near midnight, the phone rang, breaking the oppressive stillness. Thomas's voice was brief but firm. We caught them all. They were celebrating a new score. He said that the team had raided the Phantom Hospital at dawn. Eleanor, Ernest, and 4 other accomplices, including a man Thomas suspected was Eleanor's new lover. They were caught in the midst of a luxurious party with expensive wine and food, luxuries Jack would never have afforded, not even by selling his whole life to save her. They didn't have time to react, Thomas said coldly. The police found fake documents, computers with data from other scams, and a safe full of cash. But what made me tremble was the news about the children. Liam and Sophie were there, Thomas continued. They were taken to a social services center while their guardians are confirmed. Jack jumped up, his eyes red and his voice trembling. "My children, I have to go to them right now." I took his hand, trying to calm him, although I was also in knots inside. We ran to the car and drove to the social services center in the middle of the night. The hours we spent waiting there seemed eternal. Jack was beside himself. He paced back and forth in the cold hallway, muttering, "Mother, if anything happens to them, I couldn't live." I hugged him and whispered, "They'll be fine, son. We'll bring them back." But deep down, I was scared. Afraid that the days trapped in Eleanor's lies had left scars on the innocent souls of those 2 little ones. After almost 2 days working with the solicitor and the authorities, we were finally allowed to pick up Liam and Sophie. As we entered the small room of the reception center, I saw Jack kneel and open his arms. Liam and Sophie, with confused faces, stood still for a moment, as if they didn't believe it was their father. Then they ran to him, crying inconsolably. "Daddy." Sophie clung to his neck while Liam held his hand with red eyes. "Where's Mummy, Daddy? Why didn't she come to get us?" Sophie asked in such an innocent voice that I felt my heart break. Jack just hugged them tighter without answering, but I saw his shoulders tremble. I knelt, hugged all 3 of them, and held back my tears. "From now on, Grandma will always be here with you, okay?" The 2 nodded, though their gazes were still full of confusion. The investigation lasted several months, and each day was another test. The police discovered that Eleanor and Ernest's fraud network had been operating for years, deceiving hundreds of victims and stealing millions of pounds. Eleanor was not only an accomplice, but also responsible for finding and approaching prey, using her sweet appearance and her role as a nurse to gain their trust. Every new detail that came to light was like another stab in the heart. I had loved her, treated her like a daughter. I had stayed up all night cooking soup, and it had all been a perfectly planned act. On the day of the trial, Jack and I arrived early. The court was in the city center, an old building with long corridors and the smell of damp wood. I took Jack's hand and felt his skin icy cold. We sat in the front row facing the judge's bench. When Eleanor entered, I hardly recognized her. She wore the gray prisoner's uniform. Her long, shiny hair was now cropped short, her face pale, not from illness, but from the evident fear in her gaze when her eyes met ours. She immediately looked away, unable to hold them. I looked at her with an empty soul, without rage, without relief, only with a sense of loss impossible to describe. The prosecutor presented the evidence, the USB video, Philip's testimony, other testimonies from victims deceived by Eleanor, and financial records showing how the money from Jack's account had ended up in the hands of Eleanor and Ernest. Philip was called as a witness. He stood before the court, his body thin, but with a firm, clear voice. He told everything. How Eleanor approached him, promising him money to save his wife, and how he falsified documents. He didn't make excuses, he just bowed his head. I know I was wrong, I just wanted to save my wife. But I ended up making many people suffer. Seeing him, I no longer felt anger, only compassion. He had paid with the greatest loss of his life. Jack was also called to the stand. He stood upright, without looking at Eleanor once. His voice was so calm it was chilling. As he recounted the days he sold everything, the car, the garage, the wedding ring, to save the woman he loved. He spoke of sleepless nights, the pain of losing his children, the despair of discovering that everything had been a lie. I want nothing, only that my children are safe, he said, his voice broken. I, sitting below, let the tears fall in silence. My son, who once smiled like the sun, was now there, like a shadow of his former self. Finally, the judge delivered the sentence. Ernest, the mastermind, received 20 years in prison for fraud and organized crime. Eleanor, as an active accomplice, was sentenced to 12 years. The other accomplices received between 5 and 8 years. Philip, for his cooperation and sincere confession, only received 2 years. A considerably reduced sentence. Upon hearing the verdict, Eleanor collapsed. She screamed, cursed, resisted as the guards led her out of the courtroom. "You don't understand. I had no choice," she cried, but no one in the room was moved. I watched her leave with handcuffs tight on her wrists, and when her gaze met mine, I didn't look away. I stared at her, but I saw nothing more than an icy void. That woman was no longer the Eleanor I had known. We left the courtroom, and the bright sun made me squint. Jack hugged Liam and Sophie, and the 2 children clung tightly to their father. Sophie looked up with an innocent voice. "Daddy, why is Mummy taking so long to come back?" Jack bent down, kissed their foreheads, and replied in a hoarse but firm voice, "From today, Daddy will be both Daddy and Mummy for you." I looked at my son and grandchildren, feeling a mixture of pain and strength. We had lost many things, but we still had each other, and that was the most important thing. A year after the trial, time had passed, but the wounds were still there, throbbing like scars that never quite close. I was in my small kitchen, kneading flour, feeling the softness of the dough in my hands, the bakery that had had to close during the days of crisis. Now it was open again. I gave it a new name, Sunrise, as a reminder that after dark nights, light always returns. Curiously, customers were coming in greater numbers than before. They came not just for the warm bread or the crispy biscuits, but also for our family's story published in all the newspapers. Strangers sent letters, called on the phone, or even came to the shop just to offer words of encouragement. "Mrs. Smith, you are very brave," an elderly lady told me while buying bread, her eyes bright. I just smiled, but deep down I knew I wasn't strong on my own. I had Jack, Liam, Sophie, and everyone who had stood by us. Jack didn't try to reclaim the old garage, although I knew he still remembered the days he worked alongside his father. Instead, he rented a small garage right next to my bakery, just big enough for a few cars. He opened his own workshop, but only accepted to repair old cars, those of hard-working people who couldn't afford the big garages. "Mom, I want to do something that makes sense," he once told me, his hands still stained with grease. His workshop was small, but always full of laughter, hammer blows, and grateful customers when they got their cars running again. Watching him work, I noticed the light in his eyes again, not as intense as before, but enough to know that he was finding his way. Liam and Sophie had returned to school. They slowly adapted among classmates, drawings, and writing assignments. They got used to living without their mother, although I knew that questions about Eleanor still sometimes appeared in their minds. One afternoon, while braiding Sophie's hair, she looked up and asked, "Grandma, is Mummy coming back?" I stopped my hands, looked into her clear eyes, and felt a lump in my throat. I didn't want to lie to her, but I also didn't want to break her little heart. "Your mummy is in a very far-off place, trying to correct her mistakes," I replied softly. "But you have your daddy, your grandma, and Liam. We are a family, aren't we?" Sophie nodded and hugged me, and I felt the warmth of her small arms around me. Jack, when the children asked about their mother, always answered patiently, his voice firm but full of sadness. "Mummy made a mistake, but Daddy will always be here for you." One early morning, as I was kneading the first batch of bread, I saw a thin figure peering through the bakery door. I looked up and recognized Philip. He had been released from prison early for good behavior, but he still looked gaunt with sunken eyes, carrying a lifetime of remorse. He stood there, twisting his old hat in his hands, not daring to enter. "Mrs. Smith," he said in a low voice, I would like to ask for work. I can deliver bread, clean, do whatever is necessary." I looked at him with mixed feelings between the memories of what he did and the sincerity I now saw in his eyes. Before I could answer, Jack crossed from the garage, his hands still stained with grease. He looked at Philip, then at me, and although he hesitated for an instant, he finally nodded without saying a word and returned to his workshop. I understood his gesture. "All right, mister." "Philip," I said, "from tomorrow you can take care of delivering the bread from the shop." From that day, Philip became the bread delivery man for Sunrise. He worked diligently, in silence, always punctual and without complaint. Never. Sometimes, when the oven broke down or a customer's car had problems, he would join Jack to fix it. I, from the kitchen, watched them through the window. Two men, one who lost his wife to betrayal, the other who lost her due to his own cowardice. Together, cleaning an old spark plug. They didn't talk much, they only exchanged a few words about work, but between them, there was a strange understanding. Both had suffered losses. Both had been swept away by the storm called Eleanor, and now they were learning to love again. Not romantic love, but love for what they do, for life, and for responsibility. The light of dusk entered through the bakery window, painting the flour particles suspended in the air gold. The oven was still on. The aroma of freshly baked bread filled the room. Liam and Sophie had just returned from school. Sitting at the corner table, they colored drawings of houses and trees. Liam looked up and showed me his drawing. A small house with 3 people, he, Sophie, and Jack under the Sunday grandma. "This is our house," he said proudly. I smiled, stroking his head, and felt an indescribable warmth in my chest. Sophie interrupted, "I want to draw Grandma too." And the two laughed, fighting over the red pencil. I stayed there, looking at my family, looking at the small bakery that now overflowed with laughter and voices. There are wounds that never fully heal, scars that remind us of the storms we have survived. But I understood that no matter how deep the pain, one can always move forward, as long as there are people willing to give us warmth. After all we had been through, I understood that life can be cruel, but it also gives us the opportunity to get up, start over, and find the light among the shadows. I once believed that kindness could change everything, but the truth is that blind kindness only makes us prey. Still, I don't regret having loved, because it was that love, though betrayed, that kept me going. I want to tell you something. Never let your trust be used against you, but don't let resentment dry up your heart either. Justice may be slow, but it always comes. And when we manage to overcome loss, what remains is not hatred, but the strength to keep living, to forgive, and to teach those we love to recognize true kindness. The story you have just heard has changed names and places to protect the identity of those involved. We tell it not to judge, but with the hope that someone will listen and pause to reflect. How many mothers are suffering in silence within their own homes? I really wonder. If you were in my place, what would you do? Would you remain silent to keep the peace? Or would you dare to face everything to reclaim your voice? I want to know your opinion, because every story can become a candle that illuminates someone else's path. God always blesses, and I am sure that courage will lead us to better days. Now, on the final screen, I will leave 2 of the channel's most beloved stories. I am sure they will surprise you. Thank you for staying with me until this moment.